discussing the players that you may want to trade for, may want to move on from if they're on your roster, and how to think about some of these players in terms of where they will land in ADP for 2025. That is what we're going to talk about this week on RotoViz OT. We are recording a number of shows. We're going to go position by position. We're going to give some of the names that we've been submitted by listeners over the last couple of weeks of players that maybe they're on an uncertain footing with, whether what they did in 2024 is what they're going to do in 2025, or if they take a step forward, or if maybe they disappointed this year, are we losing hope that they can hit the perceived potential that maybe we had for them in the past? We are going to kick it off with the running back position. We are doing this obviously ahead of the NFL draft, ahead of NFL free agency, during the coach and hire cycle. So some of these players could have changes in the interim, but we are going to talk with them with our thoughts on whether maybe even they will be replaced through those processes as well moving forward. Shawn, I'm pretty excited for this one because there are some names in here that are either players that finished the season strong, maybe completely disappointed this season, or maybe started and then faded away. So we have lots to talk about. How are you feeling as we record this one in the NFL playoffs ahead of the divisional round, which sounds like there's going to be a lot of cold weather games this weekend?
Beautiful. That's exactly what the NFL needs. I think regardless, Colm, we're going to get better play this upcoming weekend. It would be almost impossible for us not to. It's been too good of a season for a wild card weekend to be the final sort of taste in the mouth. The teams left look very, very good. I wish the Buccaneers were in there with that group as well. Maybe they could go over across into the AFC and take the Texans' place. But no, excited for that and excited for this discussion. Had the dynasty rankings updated last week, and we'll have more of those coming fast and furious over the next several months as we get into NFL draft time period. Kevin's been doing lots of great work on both the draft and prepping for free agency here. Colm, I've spent the last week writing up the blurbs for the 2025 RotoViz Rookie Guide. Always so much fun to dive into all of those profiles. Check in on what you thought you knew, refresh your knowledge on how those players have been playing and trying to get into a little bit of the nuance there. What was their journey like? Who's going to be very trendy because they finished fast? Who might be sitting there a little bit below the radar because a situation or a mild injury, but an injury that nonetheless was able to suppress a lot of their final year production? Some of those guys who you might be able to get at a discount. All of that will be coming soon on the shows, on the site, on the rookie guide. We can't wait for all of that. We'll have rookies incorporated into those dynasty rankings in the near future. But Colm, today we're going to go through, as you mentioned, a lot of these controversial players from the 2024 season and kind of work through what we think they're looking at when it comes to the 2025 season.
Yeah, and I'm going to throw one in, Shawn, that I didn't have on the list. I'm after adding them to the list. And as you mentioned, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, a lot of people out there, maybe with the season that Bucky Irving had, we were hoping that he came in, worked his way into the backfield, got to be a huge part of their offense. He went in and he did exactly that and became basically a focal point of the offense, became the lead back in the backfield and was very strong down the stretch. That he is a player that fits the mold for this, because is what we see in that back half of the season, can we expect that going forward? Is there another level that he could go to, or is it a case that, we got him as a 0 RB candidate this year, everything went well, and we have him on our dynasty rosters? Is he somebody that is just the peak of the value, and that, it's time to potentially, as much as we like him, look to cash in? What are you thinking for 2025 for one of your guys of the 2024 rookie guide, Bucky Irving?
Yeah, that's a very nice little publicity piece for the guide right there. We did love Bucky, and so much of the prospect work and draft work that we did last season, it did turn out to be a huge part of the 2024 success, obviously, along with Jaden Daniels, who is up to the number 1 ranked player in Dynasty Superflex, Brock Bowers, who is the number 3 ranked player overall, and then Bo Nix, who is QB7, and sitting in the middle of the second round in terms of startup value. Obviously, Colm, long-time listeners are going to know that we still very much like QBs. I have 9 in the first 2 rounds. We have 20 in the first 5 rounds. It's not that we're saying don't roster QBs, but so much of what worked for us this past season was an understanding of the way the QBs do tend to be overvalued. So they're there. They're not, taking up the first 10 picks, for example. Actually, only 1 QB in the first 5, but that's because we have names like Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, Malik Neighbors, 3 wide receivers, I believe, are going to be operating at insane levels over the next decade. They're going to be gapping their positions in a way that even these top quarterbacks may not. We also look at what is the age-related trajectory likely to be for Lamar Jackson, for a Josh Allen, for a Jalen Hurts, players who are going to rely on that rushing element to really separate from the rest of the QB position. But you asked about Bucky. He gets in there in the middle of the 3rd round, RB5. That is moving ahead of Breece Hall, which feels like absolute blasphemy to even say. Colm, we did get a little bit of a shift over the final third of the season that elevated some names like a Tyrone Tracy, a Chase Brown. It also knocked back some of the veteran running backs who were having years that didn't necessarily fit what we tend to see happen historically. In a few of those cases, the players were very good, like an Alvin Kamara, or in a perfect situation, like a Joe Mixon. I think that running back in Dynasty is deeper. We're about to have a running back class that is absolutely loaded. I think that's going to be a ton of fun. I do think that probably we're talking about a fairly substantial tier break after Chuba at around RB16, which again in my rankings takes you through almost the end of round 7. Again, these would be 2025 startup values without yet the rookies from this incoming class. Colm, Bucky over the back half of the season, one of the best scorers. You watch him play, and probably no one passes the eyeball test better, other than maybe Jahmyr Gibbs and Saquon Barkley. And then you look at some of his peripherals, the evasion rate numbers off the charts, the points above average per attempt, absolutely crazy. Anyway, you look at Bucky, and through whatever angle, and I think when we're talking about Dynasty, including what the context is for next year, how that offense is going to be able to move the ball with some of the pieces they have, he looks like a fantasy force in 2025. We know that he's small. We know that he didn't test very well athletically, but the product on the field now over multiple years suggests that he is one of the best running backs on the planet, and in a situation where he can score fantasy points.
You mentioned Breece Hall and just moving above him in the rankings. So Hall was a player that was on the list, so we'll pair them together. Obviously, coming in, heading into next season, will have turned 24, but still very young as a person in terms of running back years, starting to move along, had his knee injury in the past. But this season and what we're looking for next season in New York, there's just going to be a completely different landscape. Garrett Wilson we'll talk about when we get to the wide receiver show, but, will he even be there? Will he be traded? What will happen there? The whole back office, everything around, and then Aaron Rodgers, Devontae Adams. There's just so many moving pieces. But Breece Hall this season didn't go the way we would have hoped going into it. But still, when we look at the numbers, they're not terrible, but and you're putting them at a high rank in terms of where he is and the overall rankings. But where from the highs of what we've seen in the past to where we are now, what do you think? The numbers are telling us ahead of next season.
Yeah, Hall has this nice balance as a fantasy back between rushing and receiving. The area that he has to grow again to be a star is that he has to stay healthy enough, and the run game has to be viable enough that he can push from that sort of 7.8 range that he finished this season, which is just far too low. back into the, say, 11 points per game as a runner. Now, to do that, a lot of things have to change. You have to have a quarterback in there who actually wants to get out there and zip through some plays. We have to have an offensive line in place that is merely bad. I don't think that the Jets are on their way in one offseason to have the line that blocks like the Lions or the Bucks. We know what that's been able to do in terms of opening holes for Jahmyr Gibbs, for Bucky Irving. We know what the Eagles have been able to do for Saquon. That's not going to be there, but it needs to not be one of the worst lines in the entire NFL. One of the things that was so frustrating this year, if you had them, is that Achane, Hall, those guys being hit at the line of scrimmage on an incredibly high number of carries. They were stuffed a lot. Their rushing peripherals were very bad for two players who bring the talent that they bring, and that we know over a larger sample, again, stretching back seasons, that maybe they didn't do everything that they needed. Specifically, Breece Hall, maybe he didn't run as hard or as dynamically as some other backs. I think just objectively, we can also make that claim. But when you look at Hall and when you think about him as this big back, but a back with extraordinary explosive ability, he's sort of that Saquon Barkley, Jonathan Taylor type of player, and yet he's a better receiver as well. Now, Barkley, one of the things that we know with him, with the Eagles, is that they are not going to throw to the back. So he's being suppressed quite a bit simply by that part of the offensive context. We know he's being elevated by other parts of it, but Breece Hall is someone who's going to go out there. He's going to put up a lot of receiving value for you. And so then if you add the breakaway runs, you think about what Barkley has done this year, you think about what Achane did last year, you think about what Jonathan Taylor did in his big year. Every season is not going to be exactly like that. Obviously, you mentioned Taylor's past season, Achane's past season, because they didn't do those same things in 2024 until Taylor really went off in the fantasy playoffs. And it's not exactly out of nowhere when you're talking about Jonathan Taylor, but once you see the big play ability actually in evidence, you're like, oh yeah, that's why people liked him at the 1-2 turn. That's why he's a former 101. There's the likelihood that at some point down the line, we have that same moment with Breece Hall where it was like, oh yeah, this is why we picked him. And maybe he caught 7 passes in that game. And you're looking at a situation where no one can match Breece Hall. But there are enough questions along with just this problematic element for running backs, where, as you mentioned, even if they're very young in human years, in running back years, you're already getting into the danger zone. I think you've got to balance those two portions of Hall's profile when you're thinking about how to value him going forward.
Yeah, and obviously they brought in some younger competition that had an impact at points this season, but also Hall not being healthy. But he may be, in the dynasty eye versus the redraft eye, he may be somebody that you're starting to think about, is this the time to move on from Hall? But that's always a difficult decision when you know the upside and the talent that is there. Shawn, Christian McCaffrey, the 101 curse kind of struck again this year, missed huge chunk of the season, was back out with another chunk of the season. I did see reports over the last couple of days saying that, he says that he's pretty close to 100% healthy at this point, and if the 49ers had made the playoffs, he may have been able to get involved. Obviously, PR and things like that, we have to take it with a little bit of a pinch of salt, but you'd be hopeful that he will be ready for the start of next season. And I mentioned the Jets and how things will change there. Well, there's going to be a lot of changes as well with the 49ers in terms of how they looked on the field this year, with Ayuk missing the majority of the season, with Christian McCaffrey missing huge amounts of it, and what will they look like next season. Again, he's 28. He'll be 29 when the season kicks off next year. So much further along that age curve than Breece Hall. But what are your thoughts with Christian McCaffrey heading into this season? Again, he will be somebody who's intriguing from the redraft perspective, but we've talked about him in the past as a player where you go to the wheels fell off, and the wheels did kind of fall off this year, but those wheels could get, reattached. Could be, a full body work, and he could be ready to go to do the business again next season. How are you feeling about CMC? Is he still one of those players that you probably can't move him for his true value, so you can keep him on the rosters?
Yeah. we continue to be in the same place with McCaffrey, which is just that his points are impossible to replace if he's healthy. We didn't really get that this year. And there are some mild concerns about defenses and the league in general catching up with portions of the Kyle Shanahan offense. The perfect time to move him would have been right before he got re-injured at the end of the season. Colm, I think, to an offer that Pat and I received in our Triflex league that included Xavier Worthy, among other pieces, sort of in that time frame where everybody is frustrated with Worthy, and you're thinking that Christian McCaffrey can be the piece that puts you over the top in your dynasty playoffs. And we did go on to finish second in that league in sort of the 4-team free-for-all by a mere 8 points. And so you look at that, you think about replacing your lowest kind of flex player with McCaffrey, and you're thinking, well, I mean, obviously we would win if he stays healthy. And so you don't necessarily have regret for not making the trade. It was the right move at the time. And yet certainly I have Worthy much higher in the rankings now. And, you know, that's one of the things that you're getting with these young players. The guys who were very good in college, were drafted early, are about ready to ascend down the stretch. But it's also a situation, and one of the other names we're going to talk about here in a minute with Rome Odunze, if they don't get that push down at the end of their rookie seasons, then you're talking about potentially a lot of lost value that you may never recoup. So that's kind of the fun part of making those trades right before the trade deadline in Dynasty. The guys who are moved often can, or, you know, in this case, not moved, can really shift their values. I have McCaffrey in this group of backs that's end of round 4, beginning of round 5, that includes Jacobs, Jonathan Taylor, James Cook, Kenneth Walker. Different elements with some of those guys. Obviously with Jacobs, you have a less talented back who is also, you know, already getting into the age danger zone, but someone who scored a lot of points this year. To me, Colin looks like probably will score a lot of points next year in Dynasty, especially at the running back position. But we do also want to understand that one of the reasons that we're constantly moving guys and using the perpetual reloading mindset is that even on something that has a longer time window, values change substantially year to year. And winning the upcoming year is very important. You want to have the backs who are going to score next year, right? The players who are going to score next year. And so Jacobs, I think, valuable there. Obviously, Jonathan Taylor with the strong finish, an interesting name. James Cook, someone with a very wide range of future outcomes. He's someone who doesn't touch the ball as much as it may seem and has interesting backups behind him. You could move into an offense again in the future where it's a little bit more pass heavy, and just Cook is the other guy who's kind of coming off of this season where you have all of those explosive plays. When you're in the midst of it, it feels like they will happen forever. You know, Cook is explosive, but in his profile coming into the NFL column, not really any better and arguably worse than a bunch of guys who are going to go late on day 2, maybe on day 3 in this upcoming draft. You do want to make sure you're also cognizant of those types of elements. Does he have the talent to very clearly stay up there? But for me, McCaffrey is going to remain one of these guys where if you have him, unless you get a bit of an overpay, I mean, you just want to have a strong enough roster that you can keep him. And if he performs well, I mean, you think back to last season where Alvin Kamara is more or less the difference maker for the first 2/3. Now he does get hurt. And one of the things that we're looking at with older backs is that probably in addition to the cliff risk, you also have at least slightly different levels of injury risk. Certainly guys like Kamara and Mixon who do also need the volume because they're probably not going to have the efficiency. Every additional touch in an NFL game is a touch that you could get hurt on. There's also a cumulative effect that probably is somewhat minor, but is there. You work through those types of things. And I mean, it's easy to say, yeah, I mean, Kamara was at high risk for injury, and yet it still was more likely than not that once he got to that point, he would keep going, right? So when we're thinking about what McCaffrey could do, where he is in comparison to Alvin Kamara, now, again, that's the other thing that we have to look at is that Kamara is not nearly what he was during his peak. He's still able to score. But if we have that same kind of situation with McCaffrey, where he's still very able to score, he's still a good player, and he still has a very good fantasy profile on top of that, but is no longer what he was. I mean, if he's somebody who's going to score, 17, 18 points per game, but also brings along all of these different types of risk, and you do get a good offer, I think that you can take that offer. We want to be looking at it within that context.
Yeah, that's all very, very fair. A couple of players, Shawn, to come up. I'm going to pair some together in a moment that are in the same backfield. And this one is not necessarily to look at both the names, but to look at the one that would have held the most value. You mentioned about values changing year on year. Sometimes they change throughout the course of a season. Kenneth Walker started the year with a nice performance. He had 103 yards and a touchdown in week 1, and he then missed multiple weeks, but he came back at 80 yards, 3 touchdowns, and 36 yards then receiving as well against the Detroit Lions. But it was a case for Walker where it was like up and down, up and down, up and down. So I could imagine people who have him on rosters may be frustrated as to how the year went out. And then obviously Charbonnet came in, he had a big game in his absence. But throughout the course of the season, lots of frustrations in terms of the overall aspect. Does finish with 7 rushing touchdowns, 1 receiving touchdown, but as mentioned, 3 of those coming in one game. From the rushing perspective, 573 yards on the ground and 299 yards receiving. And we know that offensive line caused a lot of trouble for both him and Geno Smith. But Kenneth Walker was somebody who we were obviously very optimistic about entering kind of week 5. Didn't work out in week 5, and it was just up and down, as we mentioned. We talked about him throughout the season. What are your thoughts on how that's going to work out in Seattle? He also has Zach Charbonnet to contend with there at the moment as well.
When we look at Walker, there are multiple elements that we have to consider. The unfortunate part here is that when he gets hurt, we also get sort of the arrival of Charbonnet in a much more real sense than we necessarily had in the past. Charbonnet is one of these guys who is a little bit more of a James Conner type of profile. And, Conner has been good the last several seasons. He doesn't have the dynamism of a Kenneth Walker, but he does give them this downhill component. When you're looking at what Walker does, right? He finishes the season with a 30% evasion rate. To put that in a little bit of context, the only other sort of high workload backs to even go over 20 are some names like James Conner at 26, Jaylen Warren and Bucky come in around 21. Gibbs is someone who's actually been better at the NFL level than in college. Certainly adjusted for context, that's the case. He's around 21%. And then you have a flurry of guys who are sort of right at 20. You're talking about Walker's ability to break tackles and force missed tackles on a per touch basis is like 50% better than even the other good backs in that type of category. That means something. He's also got the speed and the big playability. If we want to have someone with a season like what we got from Saquon Barkley, like what we got from HN the previous year, a player like Walker has that potential. And then he also brings the receiving explosiveness that gives you a guy where he can be someone who, in the right context, in the right offense, gets up to where he's about a 20 EP per game guy, and then could blow that up to where he hits for 4 fantasy points over expected, gives you a 24 point per game season. The problem that he has, obviously, is that now Charbonnet, as a Conner type of complement, will probably dig into that more than what we were thinking a few weeks ago. You look at both of these guys, when you strip out some of the other things that are happening, you look at the impact of offensive line, both of them are among the top backs in the NFL in terms of points above average per play. Charbonnet came in just above Walker there. So Walker doesn't have the explosiveness, but he does get downhill. Walker has the ability to run sideline to sideline, but doesn't always go north-south. Even with that being the case, he is a guy who still comes in the overall grades. What is he adding from a points perspective to your team? A very positive type of back. When you look at that, the main thing that jumps out again, similar to the situation with the Jets, is that the Seahawks are not a good run blocking unit. And that's probably what gets the offensive coordinator fired. It may have also been a situation where personalities didn't quite mix, maybe some differences of opinion on, how we want to prepare and some philosophical elements about controlling the game. But I do think that when you're talking about being a physical team, controlling the line of scrimmage, asserting your will with the run, it starts with the offensive lineman, and Mike McDonald is going to need the GM, the organization there, to give him those guys in the trenches if you want to run the offense that way. I do think they'll make that change in the offseason. They're certainly a lot further ahead than the Jets. So I think some of the concerns that we have about Walker are probably concerns that can be addressed more quickly there than they can in the New York situation.
Chase Brown, Shawn, next up, started the season, a lot of injuries. Well, maybe not a lot of, but not banged up, not fully healthy. Had Zach Moss to contend with in Cincinnati, worked his way into the split. Zach Moss went down with an injury, unfortunately, and Chase Brown really pushed on down the stretch, became key parts on a number of our rosters. How high should people be on him entering next season in terms of, can he be just the bell cow back for the Cincinnati Bengals, who we've seen how explosive their offense was this year? Or is there a chance that, there may be some overcorrection and people may overvalue him entering this offseason?
Brown is the guy that I do want to keep my expectations in check on a little bit. I have him at running back 14. If people want to jump him over Kyron Williams, you can certainly do that. If you want to jump him over Tyrone Tracy, that also makes plenty of sense. We don't know for sure what the context is going to be there. There's always the likelihood that the team is going to try and put a stronger complement around him than what they had after Moss got hurt. There's also the likelihood that when you're not chasing down the stretch of another lost season, that you simply rest him a little bit more. You have certainly some play calls in the offense where they want the passing game running back to be able to block, and those types of lost snaps can have a small impact on what your receiving EP ends up being. He's not a guy who's going to necessarily break a ton of tackles. So many of the teams want a physical complement to their speed guy. But Colm, having said all of that, once they got the full look at him, and every single play, he looks shot out of a cannon. He gives them that elite receiving option out of the backfield.
He's perfect for this offense.
He's perfect. I mean, he's a very good running back. The talent level is there in a way that I don't think they gave him credit for. Certainly that the fantasy industry didn't give him credit for coming into the season. He's a guy where, and again, this is a big part of the thesis that Blair and I had for him coming into the NFL, and that Blair wrote about extensively, is that he had been an extreme workhorse his final year at Illinois. I think he can hold up to a lot of the work he's being asked to do. It's a little tricky to evaluate one of your favorite players. It's a little tricky to evaluate them after they've hit, because the tendency to tell yourself and everybody else, anybody who will listen to you, that, you were right on all of the merits. I think we want to understand that what happened over the second half of last season was probably a moment in time that won't be replicated exactly like that. But Brown is a good back who should score a lot of points And their push over the second half of the season was predicated on a lot of things that weren't him, but certainly I think having him as the guy and not losing so many of the offensive touches to a less efficient play in Zach Moss, that was at least part of it. Because when you give up a touchdown every drive, you can't have a lot of your own drives and in punts.
Yeah, that's 100% fair. Shawn, two backfields I'm going to try and squeeze in here at the end. We get the Carolina Panthers, unfortunately, coming into the season. Obviously, they draft Jonathan Brooks. He re-injures himself during the season, which is obviously a huge blow for him. We have him and Chuba Hubbard. Hubbard also, during the season, having a strong season, got rewarded with a new contract. More veteran presence if we're looking at, managing the age of your roster moving forward. But he looks certain to start next season as the lead back again, and an offense that should be continuing to improve now with Bryce Young and how he is developed. We'll be talking about him on the quarterback episode. But Jonathan Brooks, the question that came in was, is he somebody that we should be trying to get on the roster at a discount as we move forward? And then Chuba Hubbard, Shawn, feels like one of those plays. You mentioned James Conner earlier, veteran running back that maybe we're thinking is going to not have a sustained run, but could have a really strong 2 seasons here, and is not somebody I think that is going to be hugely expensive if you're looking to add a running back to your roster.
Yeah, Hubbard, one of our favorites. Certainly regret not leaning into that and taking the Brooks side. Excited to see him, get that respect, the contract. You look at his wins above replacement, the way that SIS sort of adjudicates those using the EPA, but then their points basis where they distribute those. They work through a bunch of charting elements, give credit to different units within the play, within the roster. He finishes with just 1/10 of a WAR below what Saquon Barkley, James Cook, and Chase Brown provided combined. Now, again, that's obviously not really the right way to look at it, but it underlines how good Hubbard was. And he was the guy they could rely on. He took 250 carries. He helped them bridge from this catastrophic start of the year for Bryce Young into the time period where you're playing Andy Dalton, back to the young emergence down the stretch. He gave them a foundation piece as they try and elevate these young receivers, as they try and find some semblance of a passing game. We just have no idea what's going to happen with Brooks. I don't think that you want to ignore him completely. Ideally, this return, even though there are elements of a second tear that become even more problematic, but you're going to start right from the beginning with an NFL team heavily incentivized to give him the best medical care possible. We get improvements in rehab and medical approach, every month, much less every year. He's someone I think if you probably want to keep. You're going to have to sell for almost nothing if you move on from him. With Bryce Young looking like a viable short-term starter and potentially a well above average, if probably never elite, long-term starter there in an offensive situation where suddenly the context is a lot better. I think that both of these guys are interesting for the long term, and certainly we're just rooting for Brooks after what is just a heartbreaking start to his professional career.
Yeah, and then the last backfield to squeeze in here, Tyjae Spears, Tony Pollard, Tennessee Titans. Pollard, again, obviously starts with the Cowboys, and he's in behind Zeke Elliott. And, you kind of think like Pollard, then now he's on the second contract. He's going to be 28 entering this season. So those years, I mentioned the running back years, they move along very, very swiftly. We get Tyjae Spears, who didn't show a lot in the early season between injury, performance, and opportunities, but came on very strong down the back end of the season. Tony Pollard had some really strong games throughout the year, but kind of faded a little bit towards the end. How are you looking at them entering next season? Is there like a clear opportunity here to move towards Tyjae Spears in this backfield?
I think a lot of it's going to come down to health. Spears is another guy where he's really accumulated a lot of injuries that are concerning injuries when it comes to his long-term health, when it comes to his short-term football health. He should be ready for the 2025 season, and yet I think that you at this point have to just simply be aware of the heightened risk with him. Now, as a player, the peripherals would suggest that there are elements that he's doing better than Pollard, even though they don't show up in the more straightforward stats, which I think you also have to consider, right? You have Spears with an evasion rate that is double Pollard, who had very poor numbers there, 11.5% for Pollard. I mean, that's not really playable if you have other options. It's certainly not a guy you want to give 260 carries to. Now, he was at 2.8 yards after contact per attempt, a half yard ahead of Spears. So the yards are what matters, right? One of the things that we always want to emphasize is that not everyone does the same thing when they evade tackles. If you don't go forward, if you don't get downhill, it doesn't help you. When you look at what those numbers translate into in terms of how SIS is looking at it within the overall context, some of those differences there are enough to push Spears to, 0.2 of a win, and Pollard at minus 0.3. They think that Spears gives you more and that Pollard is probably costing your team victories. I think that's, again, probably not exactly the way to look at it. I think it exaggerates the gap between those two backs, but you would expect a more even workload if everybody can stay healthy and everybody play to the level that you're looking for. The other thing the Spears gives you is that receiving ability, but you have to have a moderately viable offense and you have to have a healthy back for those things to matter. Probably at the prices that we're going to get, I would be staying away from both of those two options.
And that is going to be where we close out this running back edition, looking at players that may be in the middle ground ahead of the 2025 season. We are going to do quarterbacks, tight ends, and wide receivers throughout this series over the next week. So make sure you are subscribed and you'll get those once they are available. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at Overtime. My co-host is Shawn Siegele. Check out all of Shawn's work up on rotoviz.com. And until we are back, have a good one.